When we consider the ramifications of the time of trouble when you can't buy or sell unless you take the mark of the beast, that brings some interesting things to contemplate. Most of us are used to running to the grocery store to buy materials and food and produce, but we all know that an interruption of the food chain can really create havoc. And those who have lived through coronavirus pandemic realize how easily the food supply can be interrupted. My wife and I used to spend the winters in Arizona, and one day she went to our favorite little grocery store called Sprouts, which was kind of a healthy grocery store chain. And when she got there, there was no produce at all to be found. And she asked the produce manager what was going on, and he said, "Well, our truck hasn't arrived today." So that really shocked her because it showed how easily your sources of food can be interrupted. So we know that our bread and water will be sure during Jacob's time of trouble when you flee for your life and hide in the rocks and the mountains, and God will take care of you because probation is closed and there's a death decree. But we also know that the longer time of trouble is the little time of trouble, as it's called, because it is less severe. It starts with National Sunday Law and then increasingly gets more difficult until it climaxes with there being a national and eventually an international Sunday law with a death penalty if you don't go along with things. Well, if you don't take, the Bible says, if you don't take the mark of the beast, you're not going to be able to buy or sell. So if you're faithful and you don't accept the mark of the beast, how are you going to live during this a little time of trouble? And we have counsel to live in the country so you can grow a garden. So the question we're going to address in this segment is, how much of a garden do you need if you can't buy or sell? And how much of a garden do you need when it needs to sustain you for a whole year? So we'll start with a Bible verse, Ezekiel 38:7. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. So here scripture is recommending to us to the value of being prepared for you. Last Day Events, page 99 and 100 says, a very familiar quote, "Again and again the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country where they can raise their own provisions. For the future, the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one." So notice that one of the main reasons for moving out of the cities is so you can have enough room to grow a garden. And by the way, so you can grow a garden in enough privacy that you don't have neighbors stealing your stuff out of your garden, like would happen if you did it in a backyard in the city. So we need to be in the country. We need to be able to know how to grow a garden. For in the future, the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. So the reason to move in the country and have a garden is for the little time of trouble when you can't buy or sell because you're not taking the mark of the beast. So once again, how big of a garden do you need to accomplish that? And to be able to do it have enough food for the whole year for your family. Continuing, we should now begin to heed the instruction given us over and over again. Get out of the cities into the rural districts where the houses are not crowded close together and where you'll be free from the interference of enemies. So see, your houses aren't close together, you have enough room for a garden, and you're able to get the proceeds from the garden rather than having interference with enemies. So what size of a garden is needed for a family to live off for a full year? Well, I would like to recommend a now out of print book, Dr. Lloyd Amy. At the time he made the book, he was a university professor of biology at Pacific Union College in California, and he's now retired and in his 90s. But he has been a master gardener, involved in his retirement with the Master Gardeners organization locally. And when he, in the 70s, was teaching biology, um, the course, the introductory biology course, was really designed for biology majors. So Lloyd went to a faculty meeting and said, you know, we really need a course that's for non-biology majors, something practical. And so, of course, because he suggested, they said, okay, do it. So then he started to hunt for a textbook and couldn't find one appropriate for what he wanted to do. So Southern Publishing, when he approached them and asked about it, said, if you write it, we'll print it. So he embarked on writing this as a textbook, if you will, for his class. It's not a big book, but it's quite thorough. And because it was in the 70s when the hippies were quite the thing and everybody wanted to get back to Earth and live off the land, that was a very popular mindset. So he staged this textbook under the premise of moving into the country, and he called it The Country Way, but it is actually a book about gardening. Later, in later years, it became reprinted and made with a nice color cover and a spiral binding. And both of these books are currently out of print. But here's some excerpts out of this book, The Country Way, page 184. Those who have a desire to exit the cities should do well to learn as much as possible from the experiences of those who have tried it. Excuse me, both successfully and unsuccessfully. Your country dwelling friends can be your best teachers. You will have to adapt their techniques to fit your own lifestyle, but their successes and failures can supply you with both courage and caution. So in the Country Way book, Lloyd Amy shows a picture, a drawing of a 2-acre homestead. Now he says that this was the property that his family lived on when he was a kid and lived through the Depression. They had no money. They were quite poor, and so they had to survive pretty much off of what they could grow. So in answering the question, how much big of a garden do you need to be able to sustain a family year round when you can't buy or sell? This is the first good clue that we have is Dr. Amy's firsthand experience as a child. Now this 2 acres fed a family of 4 and eventually 5 as the youngest was born. Now the disclaimer is they were lacto-ovo vegetarians, so they did have chickens of which they would eat eggs, and they did have 1 cow of which it was his job to milk the cow. So if a person was going to take this model and not have chickens or a cow, you would have to bump up the amount. But for sake of example, this is what Lloyd shows in his book. Okay, now you'll notice from this drawing that every other row of vegetables is a cover crop. So a cover crop is when you have alternating the garden and giving the other alternate part a rest. This is biblical. This is good practice. And so you will notice the picture on the left shows the fruit orchards with grapes up by the house. And then in the upper right corner are berries, probably blueberries. And then a section of vegetables. and then a cover crop, and then corn, and then a cover crop, and then potatoes, and then a cover crop. So each of these vegetable producing areas has an area next to it that is the same size, that is in essence not growing vegetables. Now, it was my understanding that a cover crop was you just leave it and just let it grow into weeds or whatever and don't do anything with it, let it rest. But Dr. Amy says that what they would do is the cover crop was peas or beans. So even though they rotated the crops back and forth periodically, all of it was productive because the cover crops were also edible, peas and beans. Another excerpt from the book The Country Way, page 173. This is one of my favorites, being as we just spent a number of years developing our latest country property and how much work it is. It says, some people seem to think they must accomplish in a few years what their grandparents spent half a lifetime doing, namely carving out a comfortable home in the wilderness. No matter whether the wilderness is a remote mountain valley or a rural half-acre, I see no sense in turning a potentially satisfying and rewarding experience into a period of nerve-shattering frustrations. So when we visit them and we've worked hard doing what we're doing, we get a good laugh, and I quote his book to him, which brings a big smile to him. So being as these books are out of print, at the time of this recording, I went to Amazon and Googled Lloyd Amy, and notice how you spell Amy. It's Eighme. So if you look up The Country Way and Lloyd Amy, then it will tell you if there are some books available, and it comes and goes. The first time I heard about this book, I went on and found one right away and was able to buy it. Obviously, they're all used, but you will see that the paperback version, which is the one in the picture, at this time was $8.98, and there were two of them available used. And then the nicer color-bound later version with the spiral backing was $25. Both of those are well worth the money. Obviously, by the time you watch this video, that will change. But that does let you know that it can be available from time to time. And now we will have recommendations from another master gardener. This individual not only has a large market garden at his country property, but he also has another location with another large garden. And then as a ministry, he has seasonally a fruit stand along the highway to sell the produce and witness to neighbors.
Gardening for a family. How much space do I need to raise produce to feed my family for a year? First, a promise. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. Genesis 8:22. In this promise, the Lord promised us that we'll have earth, and that soil is important for growing things, as is the fact that we have a sowing time and a reaping time. And we also need to have, many seeds require vernalization, that is a cold period and a warm period in order to actually germinate and grow. And also we need a photoperiod, a day length and night time space that are important critical periods for plants to actually grow and mature and become harvestable. So it's a great promise from Genesis. Next, another promise, he who walks righteously and speaks uprightly, he who despises the gain of oppression, who gestures with his hands, refusing bribes, who stops his ears from hearing of bloodshed and shuts his eyes from seeing evil. He will dwell on high, his place of defense will be the fortress of rocks. Bread will be given him, his water shall be sure. It's another promise from Isaiah 33:15-16 that tells us that our bread and water will be sure, whether that's through growing our food, seeking it through gathering, or having ravens brought to us is up to God. But it's an important promise that we can rely upon. So Calvin from Battleground, Washington had a question. He said, I have 2.5 acres and could have as much as 3/4 of an acre garden. Currently, I have a garden spot that's 30 feet square, 30 by 30. Gardens take a lot of time and energy and even some money to set up to be productive to the level of sustaining a family. I'm not sure that it is possible for us to have a garden to sustain us if we could not go to the store. So the question is, how big of a garden is needed to feed a family for a year? Well, when you're considering the size of a garden, you want to think about the size of your family. Are you a 1-person family, a 4-person family, an 8-person family? Also consider your growing season. How much time do you actually have to raise the produce that you're hoping to grow? And you can extend your growing season on either side with various tools that you may have at your disposal. Also, other available resources should be considered. What's my water that I have available? Do I have a readily available water source? Is my well going to provide enough water to irrigate and provide the water I need? And what tools do I need to actually carry on the gardening process? How many people do I have that can actually participate in this process? And then also the produce preferences that you may have as you are preparing your garden. Don't plant things that you're not planning to eat. So a rule of thumb that I found was that approximately 200 square feet per person should be allotted for a year's time worth of growing time for providing for one person. So with that in mind, 4 people, 4 times 2 is 200, or would be 800 square feet of garden. So that's an approximate dimension of 20 feet by 40 feet. So if he's doing a garden that's 30 by 30, his garden size is just right about perfect for a 4-person family. Amy's garden, Dr. Lloyd Amy, he had a garden that was diagrammed that was 3/4 of an acre, in addition to fruit trees that provided for their family of 4 during the Depression era. So there are 2 different kind of options there that show the potential size for amply feeding a family of 4 over the course of a year. So that would need to be scaled or adjusted based upon the size of your family. So as you plan, consider some things. What do we like to eat? So you don't want to plant things that you aren't planning to eat unless you're planning to share them. So you may want to plant enough to share. So that's number 3 on the list here. Will I want to have enough to preserve some as well as eating some fresh? So you want to plant in quantity enough to take you through the winter as well if you're planning to provide yourself food for a year. Also, will I want to save seed for the future? So you may need to include enough plantings that you have those that you can allow go to seed in order to save their seed, keeping in mind that some crops, and particularly the brassicas, so like kale, cabbage, and those types of things, beets, take a 2-year cycle in order to actually produce their seed. Carrots would be another one that seeds in its 2nd season. So think about those things or become acquainted with those as you consider saving seeds. Also, if you're saving seeds, you want to save or plant heirloom varieties. Those are ones that are open pollinated and non-hybridized, that are true seeds that regrow the same thing year after year from the seed. A hybridized seed it'll revert back to the original strains that it was crossed from, and you may not get a true fruit that you were expecting, the same taste and flavor and size that the hybridized generation maybe have provided for you. So sticking with heirloom seeds, non-genetically modified seeds, is an important thing to consider when saving seeds. Can I grow year-round? So some things to consider in your area are temperatures throughout the year. Maybe keep track of the first frost, last frost date, so over a period of time to get an idea of your window of planting. You can extend your season with row covers. You can see the white row covers here in a couple different fashions. You can use them as hoops or just directly over your crop. You can also use hoop houses or greenhouses. So hoop house is just simply a frame that has plastic pulled over it, a single layer. It has some protective qualities, but you can't climate control it the same way a greenhouse has. If you're in a place with snow load, you can see the upper right-hand picture. You want to be able to either get the snow off or make sure you put center supports underneath it to maintain the integrity of your structure with a heavy snow load. A greenhouse comes in many different styles, and you can be very creative with that, but typically those are climate control where you can keep them warm and moist throughout the year, but they take a lot more energy and resources to keep them going in a climate controlled kind of a situation. So a cold frame essentially, or hoop house, is typically the cheapest way to go, but can have some season extensions. You can also see the upper right picture has row covers inside the greenhouse or inside the hoop house. So that's a double layer of frost protection even on a winter day. And there are crops that you can grow inside throughout the winter. So there are other types of gardens that may be available to folks who may not have the land readily available. We have vertical gardening, so it's just simply some old pallets with dirt stuck in between, or another type of a wood frame on a wall. You may choose a south-facing wall to get additional temperature and light. You can also use trellising to get vertical space, so you're not limited to just horizontal flat space, but can also grow up as well as out. You can also use container gardening, so you can see the loaded picnic table there with a variety of different containers, old water bottles, and things used to, again, three-dimensionally grow a garden in kind of a vertical space as well. And or over here on the top right, using pots. You can also use raised beds. They're a little bit more labor intensive, but notice how they're using chips in between that to help mitigate any weeds that may make a presence. It's easier to take care of the weeds in the walkways by just covering them and keeping them completely suppressed in that fashion. So that's another way to do it rather than just open ground. So just some options. Each of them has a different cost factor, and you need to weigh that out as you work towards your garden space, whatever that may be. So some planting suggestions that I found based on a family of 4. How much of different things would you want to plant in order to feed a family of 4? And this may not take into consideration the preservation aspect, the sharing aspect, and there may be things here that you particularly don't have a taste for, and so you'd want to choose something else. I'll also note on the next few slides which varieties are easy to maintain or harvest over the winter and can be good through season crops. So beets, a 20 to 30 foot row for a family of 4. You may want to plant more if you want to can them. You can also eat the beet greens, and you can harvest the beets through the winter by leaving them in the ground or mulching them well with straw or something like that to keep them from freezing. Bell peppers, 10 to 15 plants. And you could also do jalapeno or hot peppers if you choose. Broccoli, 12 to 15 plants. These are a kind of a longer growing season kind of a plant. Carrots, a 12 to 16 foot row is what's suggested. Also, these are winter harvestable, so you may want to grow a larger quantity so that you can eat them through the year. They could also be canned or dried. Corn, 40 to 50 plants, depending on how much you like corn. And be sure that you're getting a non-genetically modified type of corn that you can eat with confidence. Cucumbers, 4 to 6 plants or 2 to 4 vines, depending on if you're a bush or a vine style. A vine style will take more space, but then again, you can do vertical vining as well on a fence or a trellis. Eggplant, 6 to 8 plants. Kale, a 12 to 20 foot row. This is a great winter harvestable source of food. Lettuce, a 20 to 30 foot row. This can grow all through the winter if it's covered with a row cover. Melons, 4 to 6 plants. Depending on where you are, you may need to have them inside of a greenhouse or a hoop house in order to get the heat necessary to grow melons well. Potatoes, 40 to 50 plants. These are also winter harvestable and storable. And actually, this is one of those plants that if you only had potatoes, you could eat just potatoes and live healthfully and have enough energy and have all your nutrients supplied with just potatoes alone. They might get a little bit old. They've done some research on that and showed that that's completely possible. They did add some oil and some flavorings at some point just because potatoes can be kind of bland if they don't have anything else with them. But in and of themselves, they have the nutritional profile that can sustain life healthfully. So potatoes could be a good resource. Spinach, a 30 to 40 foot row. There are different varieties that can also be grown through the winter. Squash, 4 to 6 plants, different types. You may want to choose like a Hubbard squash for winter storable varieties. So a wide variety of different types out there, summer squashes as well as winter squashes that can give you good vitamin A and other nutrients through the winter. Tomatoes, 5 to 8 plants. You want to grow these inside. Here in the Pacific Northwest, there's a blight that when the rain hits the ground, it pops that blight up onto the plant, and usually it's right about the time the plants are doing their best production that they get hit with a blight. So in a greenhouse, doing watering at the base so it doesn't splash is the way to grow healthy tomatoes in the Pacific Northwest. Zucchini, 4 to 8 plants. These are the plants that keep on giving, so don't want to overplant zucchini, but zucchini is a good, and you can also freeze that. And some other ones, onion, garlic. These are great storable ones, as well as great medicinal value resources. Chard, green beans are also excellent food that you may choose to include in your garden. And then any other thing that you may particularly like. So don't be afraid to experiment with what you grow. So onions and garlic can be particularly beneficial from a medicinal standpoint, warding off viral infections and keeping you healthy throughout the year. So that'd be a good resource to have stored away. As you're planting, you should take into consideration just your climate. So there are various climate maps out there that give typical regional temperatures. So you can definitely alter the climate with greenhousing, or growing on a south-facing slope tends to change the climatic regions significantly depending on the pitch of the slope. You get too steep, of course, and then you have other challenges with the terracing and so forth. But consulting these maps can give you an idea of what types of things will grow well in your area. So if you're planning to save seeds or buy a bunch of seed to keep over the course of a year or several years, seed does have a storage life. Typically want to keep it in a cool, dry environment to maintain its viability for a extended period of time. You can see a variety of different things here. Looks like onions and parsnips have the shortest shelf life. Things like tomatoes can be up to 6 years, lettuce 5 years, arugula up to 6 years. So depending on the variety and the conditions in which it's stored. So some things you'd want to maybe keep a rotating stock of plants that can go to seed to collect the seed, so you can keep seed on hand to continue your food store capacity. So just something to keep in mind. So you want to be sure you protect what you grow from things that may want it more than you do, like deer, birds, elk, slugs, dogs, etc. You can use several different types of approaches. You can use various types of fencing, bird netting, motion-activated sprinklers, wire mesh, etc. to help ward off those things that are trying to get the same thing that you want. So the motion-activated sprinkler just simply deters birds and other animals, rabbits, dogs, etc., by activating a sprinkler that would not only frighten it and startle it, but also spray it. Upper right corner, you can use bird netting, not only to keep deer out, but also birds. So that can help keep birds away, particularly on berries, things like blueberries. You can use fencing to keep deer out. The lower left is a bird net fencing. We use this for the first 3 years of our garden before we put in a more substantial fence. We just put in PVC pipe 10-foot lengths over a piece of rebar in the ground, and then strung with zip ties this bird netting around our garden space, and it worked very well for those periods of time. During the winter, not as well when it snowed, just because the snow tends to weight it down and it can break it down. So but it's a good summertime alternative. And then more substantial fencing of various forms. This is just one example on the lower right of your screen that can keep other deer and things out. More substantial fencing, of course, would be required for things like elk. Another strategy for keeping other birds away: hummingbirds are not a detriment to your crops, but they can deter other birds. If you just hang a hummingbird feeder in a cherry tree, for example, they will tend to protect the cherry tree from other marauding birds in their efforts to protect their nectar source. So they are very efficient at this. Also, you can use reflective scare tape to scare the birds away if you don't want to go with the netting option. So there are different approaches. Rabbits can tend to be a problem. In the upper left corner, there's a silt fence there. Some have suggested that if the rabbits can't see what they want to eat, they won't want it. So if you block their view, they have less of a tendency to come into your garden. So that's one approach. Another approach is the chicken wire. You can see the kind of the L-shaped chicken wire there, some on the horizontal surface as well as the vertical surface to help prevent rabbit penetration, which we've used as kind of a combination of that in our situation. On the lower right, you see a wire mesh cone around the base of a tree. Sometimes rodents and rabbits can do devastation on the base of a tree trunk, and doing a little hardware cloth cone around it can help keep those rabbits from chewing on it. You can use that same hardware cloth cone like that to keep slugs from going into and eating produce. Particularly, this would be like specific quantities of things. Probably wouldn't be a massive scale kind of a usage, but we've used it successfully around hosta plants, which are a favorite of slugs, and we haven't had any slug issues on those plants over the course of a couple years now. At the bottom left of your screen, you can see a website, growingyourgreens.com. This is a good website that you can just go to. It has a variety of different videos. The young man who leads these out, he's very enthusiastic, but can give some good perspectives on growing in a lot of different ways. And his goal is to just get you growing, whether it's a large scale or small scale. So you may check that out, growingyourgreens.com. So some other ways to keep slugs at bay using diatomaceous earth. That's the white powder you see coming off the shovel there. It's like glass, and it's not something that slugs enjoy. It kind of irritates them and is not good for them. Although anytime it rains, you have to start over again because it then deactivates it and causes it to cake. Ducks love slugs, so you could have a bevy of ducks that come running through your garden on a daily basis. You wouldn't want to leave them in your garden because they would tend to go after your other vegetation, but they would definitely go slug hunting if that's something that you have access to. The other way that I've done is just physically pick them off. So pick them and huck them away from your garden. I don't like to kill them if I don't have to, but I can translocate them to a place where they aren't bothering my produce, and that's what I prefer to do. It can be kind of a slimy affair, but it's fairly effective if you can do that right away in the spring. When you start seeing them first, just start picking them off and removing them. You'll have a better season. So some ways to maximize your harvest. You can start with succession planting. So that's planting, staggering your planting so that you have things ripening in over a period of weeks instead of all at once. You can also make an effort to replant a new crop immediately after you harvest so that you clear the previous crop and plant in its place a new crop so that the space is actually never bare. You always have a crop rotating in. You can also do interplanting, which is using the space between slower maturing crops for more rapid ones or plants. So that's a useful tool, as well as companion planting. Planting plants that aid each other, have beneficial synergies together from a pest management standpoint can be helpful. Also, regular and early harvest. If you start harvesting soon, the plant produces longer, and if you regularly harvest, it produces longer. Because the plant's idea is that it's trying to make seeds, and if it completely keeps having the seed-forming fruit plucked off, it'll keep producing new fruit for a longer period of time as it attempts to reach that seed-bearing capacity. So that regular and early harvest can help prolong the productivity of your harvest. So eating through the seasons, fresh is best, of course. If you're picking it and eating it straight off the vine as it's ripe, that's the best. But we can't do that typically year-round. So if you look at preserving things, freezing is actually probably the best from a nutritional preservation standpoint other than fresh, although that can use electricity and other resources that may not be available. Canning would be the next one. Canning is a long-term storage solution that, although it does decrease nutrient value a little bit through the cooking process, it is highly valuable way of long-term storage. Drying is also an excellent way to do that. Use a food dehydrator, or freeze drying. Freeze drying is actually very good, right up there with freezing and fresh, although it has much more expensive equipment that has some fairly significant maintenance and power consumption elements to it, if that's a consideration. So a number of different resources I'll just go through here that may be helpful as you launch into a garden. We have deer-proofing your yard and garden, so using different plants that deer in particular don't appreciate in amongst the ones that you do, hence making it less appetizing to them. Carrots Love Tomatoes is about companion planting, so which plants help each other and can synergize together. The Organic Gardener's Handbook of Natural Pest and Disease Control, so a way to look at keeping your plants healthy and minimizing pests without using herbicides and pesticides, particularly pesticides, as a way to mitigate those. So keeping healthy plants is one way to keep healthy produce, and healthy soil is important for health. The Lean Farm, how to minimize waste and increase efficiency. It's an excellent text. Also, how to grow food in your polytunnel all year round. So this would be one to consult and get some ideas for growing year-round produce that will keep you fed throughout the year. Vegetable Gardening in the Pacific Northwest is a specific text that particularly addresses growing conditions in the Pacific Northwest, which is where we are located, and many of you are located. Also another one called The Urban Farmer, Growing Food for Profit on Leased and Borrowed Land. So Curtis Stone has made a business of doing this on a market scale, but using leased and borrowed land in communities, in towns. So he has some great resources for developing and thinking about putting a garden in an urban setting. Compact farms, just looking at small acreages and how to maximize the production in a compact space. So it doesn't have to be a huge spread, but Josh Volk of Slow Hand Farm gives some good advice on small farms. Also Charles Downing and How to Grow Winter Vegetables, another way to season extend the fresh on your plate is a good resource. The Weeder's Digest is a fun book, identifying and enjoying edible weeds. So just because you have weeds in your garden doesn't mean that they need to be necessarily yanked out, because many of those have high nutritional profiles that can actually be eaten themselves. So don't discount weeds. They can actually be an important resource, especially if you know what they are and you don't have a garden somewhere. If you're on the move for whatever reason, you may be able to harvest the weeds that are around you for nutritious culinary purposes. Just make sure that, if at all possible, they have not been sprayed or any herbicides used upon them. Kind of the go-to person for organic gardening is Elliot Coleman, and he's written a book called The New Organic Grower, and it has a lot of techniques and tools for home gardeners as well as market gardeners, and it's a great resource. Then we have the Organic Farming Manual, which is a way to kind of start running an organic farm, but it has just kind of a good reference point for various tools as well as processes for farming in an organic fashion. John Seymour has a book that I've had for quite some time, The Self-Sufficient Life and How to Live It. Goes from everything from tools to preserving to gardening, and is a fun book from a pictorial standpoint as well as a practical application standpoint. Then we have the Encyclopedia of Country Living, which is a manual for living off the land and doing it yourself. This is one that I've gone to numerous times for canning times and things to do with preserving and a whole host of different things. So it's really a good manual to have. It has basic beekeeping, baking bread, milling your own flour, logging, so quite a scope of topics that it covers. And then thinking about fresh food from small spaces. If you don't have land or a very small land, you can actually get a lot from just sprouting. And we talked about vertical gardening and container gardening, so it talks about some of those things. And then Elliot Coleman has also written a winter harvest handbook that specifically talks about ways to extend your season and be able to eat fresh through the winter.